Okay, and welcome to early July 1851, and 6 months into the game, and it's been a more interesting second quarter actually than the first. The first quarter was sort of relatively uneventful. It was just a case of kind of economic administration and sort of overseeing domestic market sales and stuff like that. That can seem like quite sort of boring stuff, I suppose, probably if you're just following a game. But it's the kind of nuts and bolts of how a game works, really, and it's one of those games that it takes quite a bit of turn to sort of yield results. You have to I tend to keep an eye on those figures to try and gauge how we're doing. Now, there's been some interesting developments in Aden. We'll scroll down and have a look at the layout of the land. So in late April, we started receiving reports of Yemeni tribesmen concentrating around the Hadramaut region, as we had sort of feared at the time. Khurshid Pasha at the time was screening to the south. And the fear was that they would kind of sneak in behind him and move in towards Sana'a and disrupt our sort of efforts to build trade posts, to build missions and this sort of thing. So we decided to sortie Khurshid Pasha north into Hadramaut and engaged the Yemeni tribes in a fairly sizable pitched battle. I mean, sizable when we're talking about small forces, I suppose. Sizable kind of pitched battle in Hadramaut, inflicting about 2,000 casualties on a force of about 4,000. So we destroyed nearly half of their force. Khurshid Pasha himself only lost about 160 men. Subsequent battles basically the region of Hadramaut's been a place of kind of running battles, cat and mouse games really, between Lieutenant General Khurshid Pasha and the Yemeni tribesmen. They have eventually broken off and fallen back. Subsequent engagements, they were defeated insofar as they would leave the battle. They would kind of pull back, and casualties were relatively light on both sides, usually about 400 to 600 apiece, 400 to 600 each sort of thing. Now, our Marine Division, the two brigades, arrived in Hodeidah. We let them rest there for a period of time because it was a pretty stormy, difficult journey. I think we sort of noted the kind of weather conditions. You can always see the weather conditions of a particular sort of territory by sort of hovering the mouse over the region, and you can kind of get a nice, easy picture. You don't have to read a tooltip or anything like that. And weather is a pretty zero-sum question. Off-season, military units move much less effectively. They can sustain losses and this kind of thing, especially if it's in mountainous, snowy, cold terrain and that sort of thing. So weather is something always to keep an eye on. And obviously with the moving of units at sea, this can disrupt and lengthen their journey, and it means that they sometimes land in some state of disorganization. Now, the Marine Division is going to be wheeling around to the right flank of Khurshid Pasha, landing in Aden, and once we have secured enough military control in Aden, we're going to be building a colonial fortress there. We're going to be building a small harbour, which will allow this Marine Division to be consistently supplied. And then we're going to be looking at trade posts, missions, and things that we can begin to use to raise our colonial penetration of the region, and obviously also to begin to exploit tobacco, coffee. There are 3 tiles with coffee resource, and we've got opium here. Now, in Hodeidah, we have a trade post already built. In Sana'a itself, we have a trade post being built, and in both of these territories, we also have a mission. The reason for missions is they do provide us with a degree of colonial penetration, but they also drive down revolt risk, and this is a region that's in kind of early stages of kind of sort of colonial kind of exploitation. So you can see that the locals here are a tough crowd. You know, they're not going to take this lying down. And I suppose modern kind of pundits would call this asymmetric warfare. So it's all very well that Khurshid Pasha chases their main, more conventional forces to the east of the country, and the idea is that we want to eventually bottle these forces up and sort of systematically destroy them. The reality is that the further east we push, the more unstable this region becomes. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. To that end also, I built a very, very small force, just a militia brigade. So these are kind of irregular, very similar to the Bashi bazooks, albeit they are a slightly more modern version. They kind of have Western European style kind of military clothing, and there'll be slightly better quality in the Bashi bazooks. And we're going to station these guys permanently in Sana'a once they arrive. They're due to arrive in Hodeidah in about 11 days. So things are taking a sort of positive turn then in Yemen. It's good to sort of like basically engage these insurgents in a fight, come off successfully. Khurshid Pasha's forces sustained some losses, and particularly I think it's the 2nd or the 15th Regiment, and it'll take a little bit of time to make up those losses. In fact, he's only sort of down about a couple of hundred men, so gradually he'll receive replacements for those. That's it in terms of Aden, and not much to report. Again, in terms of Libya, we're just sort of looking to gradually push up. I think we're about 57%. We're just looking to gradually drive up our colonial penetration with the aim. And once we get to around 59-60%, we want to look then look to sort of make the formal kind of change to bring Libya into the fold. And we've now got stockpiled 529 state revenue for that purpose. It only costs us about 370. So by the time that opportunity arises, probably in the next month or two, we'll have some sufficient. We'll have a decent amount of state revenue left over. Now, the other interesting thing to report is on the economic front. I've been keeping a careful eye on things, and I should say that exports are beginning to taper off just a little bit. I suspect this is just because the global economy is beginning to mature a little bit. So what's happening is some kind of smaller powers who at the time they didn't have a huge amount of a certain kind of sort of commodity, they're now stockpiling this commodity, and they're looking to kind of unload it onto the world markets. There's a little bit of competition now from the smaller players, places like Brazil, Argentina. They're going to have now a certain stockpile of cereals and fish and this sort of thing. So they're going to be looking to unload it. That's going to eat a little bit into our kind of market share. This tends to go in cycles anyway. There's a little bit of a life to the kind of export market, to the global economy. Certain kinds of commodities, they don't fall out of fashion as such, but they sort of, it becomes tougher to export them for a period of time, perhaps because of competition. And then you'll quickly find that you're stockpiling a certain kind of resource, and then all of a sudden there's a huge demand for it. And each fortnight you're sort of exporting more than you're producing, which means that eventually, you'll kind of eat into this sort of stockpile. So exports are beginning to taper off a little bit, but nothing too much to worry about. Domestic market sales slightly down this turn, although up in terms of total numbers of goods sold. That reflects slightly the declining price of these goods in the domestic market, but yeah, we're selling at 220 a fortnight at the moment. And one thing that's worth pointing out as well is that the greater availability of our goods is allowing us to make a little bit more in terms of selling our goods on to our colony. So we're selling 7 units. This was only 1 or 2 about a year and a half ago, and I think in mid 1850 it was 4 or 5. So this is constantly increasing the availability of our goods to our markets. Now, the real plan has been, of course, all along to try and begin the Industrial Revolution in the Ottoman Empire. This is always the plan. And as I said very early doors, the plan was initially to build sound foundations, that is, agricultural enterprises that are reasonably productive, centered around the capital, and in areas where we have desirable commodities like tobacco, for example, which eventually will be a great export commodity, and to ensure that we have a good range of agricultural produce available to our population. And this serves a purpose of the fact that we have constant domestic market sales of these goods, but also increases average satisfaction. Average satisfaction is important for internal productivity of your workforce, whether it's agricultural labourers or workers in factories. And if we look at not our industry, regional census, here we go. If we look at our regional census, we can now see that there's actually only one territory that's currently experiencing demonstrations. It's Van, that's the east of the country, predominantly sort of Armenian and Orthodox, to be expected a little bit under those circumstances, to be fair. But at the other end of the spectrum, we're now looking at a number of territories that have fairly high levels of satisfaction. So if we look, for example, in Constantinople, we've got 98% of the population are fairly satisfied with our leadership, and for good reason. We've been developing the region, we've been pouring resources into the region and generating employment and so on and so forth. So we've got a fairly content population there. In some places like Trabzon, for example, we actually have even popular enthusiasm for the government. So if there's one thing the population likes, is they like to see things being built, and especially this will become much more pronounced with the advent of the Industrial Revolution. Now, talking about the advent of the Industrial Revolution, we now have 1,097 private capital stockpiled. This is to some extent by design. Economic growth has intentionally slowed ever so slightly in the first half of this year. Now, in the last 6 months of last year, we probably began the construction of 5 or 6 RGOs in Bulgaria, and most of those have been built now. This year, we've only built one, and that is a fruits orchard in Izmit, and that's about halfway done. We haven't built much else. In fact, we've been using our private capital to import manufactured goods. Now, manufactured goods have become somewhat more available in the world market this year, I suppose, because of the maturing of the global economy, Factories are opening up in places like Belgium, Prussia, France, UK, so on and so forth. In fact, if we look at Belgium, I mentioned, I think in my very first video, that the economy of the Ottoman Empire is about the size of Belgium's economy. Of course, I only meant that in a geographical sense. Belgium has a much more developed and sophisticated economy than we. But anyway, manufactured goods are becoming more available, which has allowed us to stockpile manufactured goods through imports to supplement our own very modest production of those goods, almost all of which come from craftsmen, of course, and also to build up a bit of a stockpile of steel. Well, that has meant that we are now in a position to build our first manufactory, and it's going to be a textile shop, which is going to cost us 857 capital at 2% inflation, 31 steel, 5 coal, 47 manufactured goods, and will take 378 days to complete. At 100% efficiency, it'll cost us 8 capital a fortnight, 1 coal, 2 cotton and wools, 2 dyes, and will produce 4 textile units. And bang. Now that is our first proper independent capitalist manufacturing. Now the Ottoman Empire does start with 3 manufactories, although sort of counterintuitively it does not have the technology to build those manufactories, which suggests that they were sort of I suppose special kinds of factories. You know, they were special projects. They were never built with the idea of this being any kind of mode of production or anything like this. They were special one-off structures that had been built in the probably the decade prior to the date this game begins, the 1840s, possibly even with foreign aid. Now this is our first proper factory, and I think it's an exciting moment. This is a qualitative leap for us, and with the development and the construction of this factory and it beginning to produce goods, this should hopefully be a bit of a pulse also to things like scientific development. We now have an economy increasingly rooted in the capitalist mode of production. If we go to our Ministry for Industry and Commerce, we can see that, for example, our manufactories, if you like, or our capitalist RGOs now produce 10 units of cereals per turn. That is, about sort of 2/3 of the entire cereals production of, if you like, all of our craftsmen. We still have a cereals production economy principally rooted in smallholders and this kind of thing, but that will soon change. In terms of fish, we produce 10 units of fish per turn. Our craftsmen only produce 7. In terms of fruits, okay, fruits is not a great example. We're currently in the process of building fruits, but nevertheless, it's an exciting development, and very gradually we're going to see our capitalist mode of production, our kind of agricultural RGOs, supplant the kind of early modern guild-based economy. So that's an exciting development. One interesting technological development that happened is military leadership. Now, a lot of these technologies, for example, just this fortnight, we developed nitroglycerine. Nitroglycerine is a purely theoretical development. It doesn't offer, in this instant, any concrete changes to our economy or anything at all. But it leads to the research of other things, so dynamite, which in turn leads to things like hard rock mining, or extraction and processing and transcontinental rail lines. So you can see that a lot of these technologies, they're theoretical, they don't do anything to begin with, but they have a sort of knock-on effect later. And about a month ago, one of the theoretical developments was military organization. It was a military organization, which in turn leads on to other things, Florence Nightingale reserve formations, military staff system, and so on. That provided us with new special kinds of units. So, for example, we began building some. These were very, very cheap. They're very, very small, 1 regiment units. And the 2 units that we have become available are provosts, or military police, gendarmerie, and engineers. These are new kinds of units, and this further brings our army in line with the kind of experience of sort of more Western European armies. The early sort of the Ottoman army of this period is really modelled on the French army. And as the French army becomes eclipsed by the Prussians, for anyone that knows their history from the sort of 1870s onwards, the Ottoman Empire in turn pivots towards the Prussians. This is exactly the same experience that the Japanese had, actually. Exactly the same experience. I mean, Japan is not there yet, but when Japan begins developing in the same way that we are, it will also initially copy the French sort of army and then sort of pivot towards the Prussians. So we're building 2 military police, 1 in Sinop and 1 in Smyrna, and also 2 engineers. The purpose of this force, once it's completed, is to head east and join up with Abdi Pasha's force in Kars, and then once the force in Smyrna, the provosts, and the engineers are complete, they will move up towards Rita Pasha. What these forces actually do, so that it isn't some sort of strange amorphous kind of thing, is you can click on them and get an idea. So engineers, fairly predictably, they have pontooning qualities, so they can provide a speed bonus when crossing rivers and this sort of thing to the entire stack that they're fused with. And they also provide a defensive bonus. You know, they're engineers, they're going to build emplacements and fortifications and trenches and this sort of thing. Military policemen, I'm not sure if it actually makes it clear, it doesn't, but military policemen provide your stack with a cohesion bonus. So in the event that you've perhaps suffered a loss or even a victory, but nevertheless your forces experience some level of cohesion loss, military police accelerate the process of bringing your force back up to kind of scratch. So they're good. These small forces actually combined really make the difference. You can have a force that is much larger than an opponent's force, and you may even win the first battle, but if that opponent has a defensive bonus and they can recover cohesion faster, on a long enough basis, you'll gradually be whittled down by them. So these kinds of small support units are important. Now, another important event that has happened this term is we've received reports of Bedouin tribes spotted in the desert at Najaf, just south of Baghdad. So to that end, Hussein Avni Pasha, he's located in Baghdad. He is activated. I'll talk about activation in just a moment, actually, since it's an opportune moment to do so. But we're going to set him for an offensive posture. We're going to set him for an all-out attack as well, because our desire is, if we engage this force, we want to destroy it systematically. My guess would be that we have a fairly significant kind of numerical advantage over this force. So in essence, we're saying we're prepared for you to take some losses. We want you to press home a really aggressive attack with your division. He's got a division. This is what 14,000 men, so he's well placed to do that. We've also set this cavalry brigade in Q8 to an offensive posture. That's just in case the Bedouin raiders fall back to Q8. There's a possibility they might do that on Nasiriyah. If they do, we can sortie them northward, or we can keep them in Q8 for now anyway, in case they fall back. Now, activation, we can see that this is activated in two ways. One, if we hover our mouse over this envelope. This envelope represents the kind of, I suppose, the communication between us and the commander. This is our sort of telephone line, or envelope as it would be then. And it says this commander is activated. Another way we know this is because this envelope is ever so slightly illuminated. If we look at a commander who is not activated, for example, Abdi or Ritza Pasha rather, you can see this this envelope is slightly kind of darkened, and if we hover the mouse cursor over the pop-up tells us this leader is not activation. What activation basically means is the commander's ability or willingness to engage in offensive maneuvers during that turn, during that fortnight period, and it could be for a whole range of reasons. So it may be simply that the commander is absent from his command, he could be sick, he could be on a sort of form of military leave, visiting friends, companions, family. Or it may be that he's with his command, but just assesses at that moment, for one reason or another, that he's not prepared to engage in offensive maneuvers. If that is the case, you are not able to click offensive posture. In fact, you're locked on either defensive or passive posture. And if you click your mouse button here, nothing will happen. In fact, I can go and sort of go to Ritza Pasha's, and sort of we'll try and do that. We'll try and see what happens. So we'll try and click stack leader, absolutely nothing happens. So it means that force, for one, cannot engage in offensive maneuvers. If you try and move that force, even on a defensive basis, it will just take longer to travel. It experiences sort of a malus, really, in terms of movement, in terms of its combat value, so on and so forth. Now, activation is not completely arbitrary. It is kind of done on a sort of die roll basis, but it's not equal among every military leader. Essentially, the leader's strategic value is kind of coupled with a die roll. The higher the leader's strategic value, the more likely they are to be activated. So more energetic, more effective commanders, and this value is not set in stone either. This value changes. In some cases, you'll have commanders who are not terribly good, but they're made. They're kind of forged in the kind of furnace, the crucible of warfare, and their statistics can change dramatically, subject to their experience. And you have other commanders who start off very, very good, and they will go on and continue to improve. But the higher the strategic value, the more likely your officers are to be activated. So if you're engaged in a sustained war, even if you're doing quite badly, your officers will gradually become more effective as time goes on. They're more likely to be able to engage in offensive maneuvers. on a sustained basis because they will have a higher strategic value. So that's basically activation in a nutshell. In terms of our report back then, we have an activated general who we're going to be sending south. Let's just check on Khurshid Pasha. Khurshid Pasha's force is in pretty reasonable shape. Now, I think I'm going to keep him in place for the time being, but he is activated, so I'm going to set him to an offensive posture. That means that because these forces are quite small, this is before the period of continuous front lines. We don't want these forces to kind of seep through. This whole area is porous. It's not as though Khurshid Pasha's force, which is 5,000 men, has some perfect continuous front line going through Hadramaut. That would not be feasible, but rather he'd be concentrated in some kind of specific location. If we set him to an offensive posture, it means that any of these columns, if they try and work their way into Hadramaut, once spotted by his scouts, he'll kind of vector in and engage them. So he'll be set on an offensive posture on that basis. He'll be aggressive. I don't think there's too much more to report. We require a diplomat. Incidentally, our diplomatic overtures to Montenegro were refused. That's rather disappointing, frankly, not least because they're a minor power. We don't really want them to fall into the orbit of the Austrians. We'll keep an eye on what... In fact, we can just do that quite quickly now. Let's have a look at their arrangements with other powers to make sure that Montenegro, here we go, to make sure they haven't arrived at... so they don't have any kind of treaties of, in effect with any other powers except an infringement casus belli on us. That'll be long term. That'll probably be because they just consider one of these territories theirs. And they are wrong. But I think that's it in terms of reports. We do have a government measure. We can dole out 500 to improve our education system. That is something that we want to do in time. We want to do that to begin to kind of bring up our level of literacy, which at the moment sits at 35%, and the higher it is, the faster our research is. Now, this is always, of course, inhibited by the fact that we're a backward power. It's never going to be the case that the Ottoman Empire is going to be developing technologies faster than Prussia or Britain or the United States. One thing I have been keeping an eye on also is the kind of the sort of social classes. So 63% of our population are peasants, 16% are workers. See if we can remember that. So with the founding of our first proper factory in early June 1851, 16% of the workforce was comprised of workers. And the plan is obviously to try and increase that dramatically. And we also have serviles, so we don't have the complete abolition of slavery in the Ottoman Empire, although slavery has probably quite a different character in the Ottoman Empire than it would have, for example, in the southern United States, because of Devshirme and so on and so forth. But in any case, so we still, I mean, we have almost as many serviles as we have workers, for Christ's sakes. Very small middle class, 2% aristocrats. But we're going to keep it. We want to keep an eye on the proportion of workers to peasants, basically, as a good metric for industrialization. I think this video I'll leave there. Nothing else to report. We've got over nitroglycerine, and we've looked at our economic development and laid the foundations for our first factory. Between now and September, which is when the next report will be, unless anything significant happens in the meantime, like a declaration of war or anything like this, which is not, I don't think is necessarily likely by any other power, then between now and then we would have probably begun the process of colonizing Libya. So my hope is that in the next report I will have positive news to report with regard to Libya, or at the very least the process of colonization will have begun, and we'll be able to see how that's going. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.